When Sophie Thompson, 12 years old, entered the courtroom at the Old Bailey in London with a folder full of drawings and a determination that chilled the blood of the barristers present, no one imagined she was about to witness the most extraordinary legal case in British judicial history. With her plaits neatly braided and her school uniform pressed, she stood before the judge and spoke the words that would change everything. "Your Honor, I am my mother's barrister." Her mother, Sarah Thompson, was charged with murder for killing the man who had abused her and Sophie for years. But when the girl opened that folder and began to speak, she revealed a truth so shocking that the entire courtroom held its breath. What happened in that courtroom would become legend in British justice. Court number 5 at the Old Bailey had never housed such a heart-wrenching case. Sarah Thompson, 34 years old, sat in the dock with the empty gaze of someone who had already lost everything. The charge was murder for killing Michael Davies, her violent partner who for 5 years had transformed their lives into a daily hell. The story presented by the Crown Prosecution Service was simple and seemingly clear. Sarah had fired 3 gunshots at Michael whilst he slept, after yet another night of violence. The prosecutors maintained it was premeditated, that she had planned everything down to the smallest detail. The evidence seemed overwhelming against her. The day before the trial, Sarah had dismissed her barrister, declaring she wanted to represent herself, a decision that had surprised everyone. A traumatized woman with no legal training facing the most serious charge in English criminal law. But no one expected what was about to happen. When the courtroom doors opened, Sophie Thompson entered. 12 years old, tall for her age, with blonde hair plaited into 2 perfect braids, and the uniform of St. Margaret's School pressed with obsessive care. She walked with determined steps, carrying a brown folder she had prepared for weeks. She stopped before the defense bench, looked at her mother with a determination that shouldn't exist in a 12-year-old girl, then addressed the judge with a clear and firm voice. The silence that followed her words was deafening. The prosecution barrister jumped to his feet. The judge removed his glasses in disbelief, and the journalists present began whispering frantically amongst themselves. The judge, the Honorable Mr. Justice William Hartwell, a veteran of 40 years in the courts, had never faced such a situation. In a paternal tone, he explained to Sophie that she could not legally represent her mother, being neither of age nor qualified as a barrister. But Sophie opened the folder and pulled out a notebook filled with notes written in the precise handwriting of a determined 12-year-old. She had studied Section 6 of the Criminal Procedure and Investigations Act 1996, maintaining that her mother had the right to choose her representative. The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. It was impossible, absurd, yet this girl spoke with an assurance that sent shivers down spines. When the judge asked Sarah if she confirmed wanting to be represented by her daughter, the woman nodded with tears in her eyes. Sophie knew everything about what had happened. Then Sophie pulled from the folder something that made everyone present tremble. A bundle of drawings made with colored pencils. They were proof that her mother had not committed murder, but had saved both their lives. When Sophie opened the first drawing, the entire courtroom held its breath. It was the beginning of a truth so terrible, it would forever change the perception of this case. The first drawing Sophie showed, the court depicted a 7-year-old girl crying in a corner whilst 2 adult figures argued. Red pencils had been used to draw stains on the female figure's face. The date, written in childish handwriting, 15th of May 2019, first time Michael hurt Mummy. The silence in the courtroom was so profound, you could hear the air conditioning. Sophie continued with a steady voice, despite tears beginning to roll down her face. She told how Michael had come to live with them when she was 7. At first he seemed nice, brought sweets, and called her Princess. But then everything changed. The second drawing showed a girl hidden under a bed, whilst 2 adults argued in the next room. The male figure had his hands raised towards the female. Sophie explained that she would hide when they began to argue, thinking at first that all daddies were like that with mummies. The prosecution barrister attempted to object, claiming the drawings had no evidential value, but the judge stopped him with a gesture, wanting to hear everything Sophie had to say. The third drawing chilled the courtroom. It showed a girl with bruises on her arms, and beside her, an adult male figure with red hands. Sophie explained this was when Michael had started hurting her too. Her mother didn't know at first, because he told her that if she spoke, he would hurt Mummy even more. Sarah, from the dock, began to sob. She didn't know her daughter had documented everything, had kept a visual diary of their suffering. Sophie continued showing the drawings, one after another. Each drawing told a piece of their lives. Visits to A&E, because of the stairs. Invented excuses for bruises. Nights spent trembling with fear. A particularly disturbing drawing was dated 23rd of December the previous year. Michael had told Sophie he would give her a special present for Christmas. The drawing showed a girl giving a note to a female figure. Sophie pulled out the real note, written with felt-tip pens. "Mummy, if we don't do something, Michael will hurt us badly. I'm scared." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the prosecution barrister seemed shaken by this raw and innocent testimony. Sophie explained this was the first time they had really talked about what was happening. The first time her mother understood that Michael was hurting her, too. The last drawing was dated a week before Michael's death. It showed two female figures embracing, whilst a male figure approached with hands outstretched like claws. Sophie explained that Michael had said that night he would teach her to be a good girl, and her mother had understood perfectly what he meant. The truth was beginning to emerge in all its horrible clarity, but Sophie hadn't finished revealing all her secrets. Sophie closed the folder of drawings and opened her notebook, written with the precision of a miniature chronicler. She began to tell with a steady voice what had happened on the night of 15th of January, the night that changed everything forever. That day Michael had come home very angry, had been drinking as always when he got furious, and had started shouting at Sarah about dinner that he didn't like. At 8:30, he had called Sophie to his room, saying he wanted to play a game that only grown-ups knew. Sarah was in the kitchen, but Sophie knew she had heard and understood. At 9:10, her mother had entered the room and seen Michael trying to abuse Sophie. She had started screaming and crying. Michael had pushed her violently and ordered Sophie to go to her room. Sophie pulled out a floor plan of the house, where she had marked the times with obsessive precision. From 9:30 to 11 o'clock, Michael had hurt Sarah. Sophie heard everything from her room, her mother crying and pleading. At 11:15, Michael had left the house, threatening that when he returned, he would finish what he'd started. The judge leaned forward, completely captivated by the account of this girl who demonstrated terrifying lucidity in reconstructing that terrible night. At 11:30, Sarah had come to Sophie's room. She was covered in bruises, with a black eye and split lip. She had hugged her, saying she really had to protect her, that she couldn't allow Michael to hurt her anymore. Sophie showed another drawing, two female figures sitting on a bed, looking into each other's eyes. That night, Sarah had told her daughter everything, confessed that Michael had threatened to kill them both if they ever spoke to anyone, that she was afraid he would commit even worse violence sooner or later. Michael had returned home at 2 in the morning completely drunk and had gone to sleep without even checking if they were still alive. Sarah had waited until he was fast asleep. At 4:20, Sarah had gone to the drawer where Michael kept the gun, the one he had bought to protect them from burglars, but which he actually used to terrorize them. She had entered the room where Michael slept, whilst Sophie stayed at the door because she wanted to make sure he didn't hurt her mother. Sophie told how she had seen her mother trembling and crying whilst pointing the gun at Michael. When he woke up, he had started laughing, claiming Sarah would never have the courage. Then he had seen Sophie at the door and spoken words the girl would never forget, threatening to properly deal with the little one after finishing with Sarah. Sarah had fired 3 times, the first when Michael tried to get out of bed, the second when he tried to reach her, the third when he moved towards Sophie. The courtroom was completely silent as Sophie concluded her account, looking at the judge with eyes full of tears, but also unshakable determination. Her mother hadn't committed murder. She had saved both their lives. Sophie hadn't finished her defense. With the precise gestures of a little investigator, she pulled from the folder a series of transparent plastic bags that made everyone present's eyes widen. She explained that for the past 2 years, she had collected evidence each time Michael hurt them, because she had always known that one day someone would need to know the truth. The first bag contained a torn T-shirt that Michael had destroyed on 3rd November. Sophie had hidden the pieces under her mattress for months. The second bag contained a photo she had secretly taken of her mother's bruises on 20th December, using the school mobile when the teacher wasn't looking. The prosecution barrister attempted to object, claiming these alleged pieces of evidence hadn't been obtained according to legal procedures, but the judge stopped him sharply. This girl wasn't a professional investigator. She was a 12-year-old child who had tried to document her own suffering. Sophie opened the third bag and pulled out a toy recorder, one of those bought in toy shops. It was a gift from Granny for her 10th birthday. When she had understood that Michael became violent at night, she had started recording sounds from her room. She pressed play and chilling sounds came from the little speaker. Screams, crying, the noise of breaking objects, and above all, Michael's voice threatening Sarah with words no child should ever hear. Sophie revealed she had 17 similar recordings, all hidden under her favorite Barbie doll, because Michael would never have looked there. The fourth bag contained papers folded with care. They were medical reports from A&E that Sophie had meticulously copied each time her mother got hurt, falling downstairs or bumping into doors. The reports, copied in childish but precise handwriting, showed an unmistakable pattern of domestic violence. The last bag contained a homemade DVD, written on with colored felt tips. Michael's Threats, 10th January 2024. Sophie explained that 5 days before her mother stopped him forever, Michael had come to her room drunk, thinking she was asleep. He had started talking to himself, describing what he would do to her and Mummy.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Sophie had hidden Sarah's mobile under the pillow and recorded everything. When the video was played, the words that came from the speakers froze everyone's blood. Michael described in detail the violence he intended to commit. Speaking of Sophie as a toy, it was time to really use. When the video ended, deathly silence fell over the courtroom. Even the prosecution barrister seemed shaken by what he had heard. Sophie closed all the bags and looked at the judge with eyes that had seen too much for a 12-year-old girl. Her mother wasn't a murderer. She was a heroine who had saved her child's life, and she was there to ensure everyone knew it. The judge removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. In 40 years of career, he had never witnessed such powerful and heart-rending testimony. After presenting all the evidence she had collected with the determination of a little detective, Sophie addressed her mother, inviting her to tell her version of that terrible night. Sarah stood slowly, trembling like a leaf, and approached the microphone. With a voice broken by emotion, Sarah began her account. She had never wanted her daughter to see everything that was happening, had desperately tried to protect her, but Michael had threatened to kill them both if she ever left the house. He had dangerous contacts, knew people who could make them disappear without trace. Sarah's voice became firmer as she explained that on that night, when she saw Michael enter Sophie's room, she understood the moment to act had come. She couldn't wait any longer, couldn't keep hoping things would improve by themselves. Sarah looked at the prosecution barrister, then the judge, explaining she hadn't premeditated anything. At that moment, she was only thinking of saving her daughter. When she took that gun, her hands were shaking so much she thought she might not even be able to hold it. Sophie stood and went beside her mother, taking her hand in a gesture of solidarity that moved everyone present. Sarah continued, telling how she had seen Michael laugh when he woke up, had seen the way he looked at Sophie, and understood this would be the last night he could hurt her. She addressed the jury directly, as they watched in silence, explaining she wasn't asking to justify what she had done. She had killed a man. That was undeniable. But she asked them to understand that at that moment she was a mother protecting her child from the monster who lived in their house. The prosecution barrister rose for cross-examination, but Sophie stopped him. She had one last thing to show. A letter she had written to Michael 3 days before her mother stopped him. She had never given it to him, but had kept it because she wanted someone to know one day what she felt. Sophie read the letter with a clear voice. It was the message of a girl who had lost innocence too early, but had never lost hope that one day someone would listen and believe her. When Sophie finished reading, you couldn't hear a pin drop in the courtroom. She folded the letter and looked at the judge with absolute determination. This was her mother's defense, a mother who had done what any parent would do to protect their child. The judge took a few minutes to reflect on everything he had heard. When he resumed the session, his face had completely changed. He was no longer just a magistrate coldly applying the law, but a man who had seen the naked and raw truth in all its tragic beauty. The adjournment for deliberation lasted 3 interminable hours. Sophie remained seated beside her mother the entire time, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort. The courtroom had emptied, but journalists waited outside, conscious they were facing a case that would make history in British jurisprudence. When the judge re-entered, his face was solemn but determined. The courtroom filled again within minutes. Everyone wanted to hear this verdict that would be remembered forever. Mr. Justice Hartwell announced the court had deliberated, but before reading the verdict, he wanted to speak some words not provided for in protocol. He stood up, which he never did during trials. He explained that, in 40 years of career, he had seen many difficult cases, but never anything comparable to what they had experienced that day. A 12-year-old girl had taught everyone what love, courage, and justice meant. He looked directly at Sophie, telling her she could never become a barrister in the technical sense due to her age, but that she had demonstrated an understanding of justice that many professionals never achieve. He then addressed Sarah, explaining that English law provided severe penalties for murder, but also mitigating circumstances for those who act in self-defense, to protect themselves or others from grave and imminent danger. The courtroom held its breath as the judge explained that, based on the evidence presented, the audiovisual testimony, and above all the extraordinary documentation collected by Sophie, the court considered that Sarah had acted in self-defense to protect herself and her daughter from violence that could have caused irreparable harm or death. Sarah Thompson was acquitted of all charges for having acted in self-defense and under duress. The courtroom exploded in spontaneous and liberating applause. Sophie hugged her mother, crying with joy, whilst Sarah collapsed in her chair, overwhelmed by emotion and relief after months of nightmare. But the judge hadn't finished. He recommended that Sophie Thompson's case be studied in law schools as an example of civic courage and pursuit of truth. And he personally promised Sophie that when she turned 18, if she really wanted to become a barrister, he would write her a letter of recommendation for any university in Britain. Sophie burst into tears, but this time they were tears of pure joy. She stood and thanked the judge with a formal bow, as she had seen done in courtroom films, and with a trembling voice told him she had always known truth would prevail. 6 months after the verdict that had swept across Britain, Sophie and Sarah Thompson began a new life in a small town in the Cotswolds, far from the painful memories of London. Sarah had found work as a receptionist in a medical practice, and Sophie had restarted secondary school in a completely new environment. The Thompson case had become a symbol of the fight against domestic violence throughout Britain. Sophie received hundreds of letters from children and adults telling her their stories of abuse. finding in her an example of courage and hope. One spring morning, whilst Sophie was getting ready for school, an official letter arrived from Oxford University. The Faculty of Law was inviting her to give a lecture on children's rights and protection from domestic violence. Sophie dropped the letter, incredulous. She was 12 years old, and a prestigious university was inviting her to speak before law students and professors. Sarah, reading the letter, hugged her daughter with infinite pride. When she asked if she was proud of herself, Sophie replied she was proud of her mother, who had been brave when she was just a frightened little girl. But Sarah gently shook her head. Her daughter had never been just a frightened little girl. She had always been a little warrior who had protected her mother with courage beyond her years. That afternoon, Sophie sat at her new desk and began writing what would become her first book, The Drawings of Truth, the story of a girl who saved her mother. In the book, she told not only their story, but also that of all women and children who suffer violence in silence. Proceeds from sales would go entirely to charities helping victims of domestic violence. The first copy she dedicated to her mother, the second to Judge Hartwell, and the third to all victims of violence who hadn't yet found courage to speak. At the book launch in London, a year after the verdict, Sophie saw Judge Hartwell again, who had come specially for the event. When he asked how the future barrister was doing, Sophie replied she was studying hard, but had understood she wanted to become a judge, like him. She wanted to become a judge because judges have the power to change lives, and she wanted to use that power to protect other children like her. 5 years after the trial that had changed her life, Sophie Thompson was 17 and about to take her A-levels with top grades. Her story had inspired concrete legislative changes in Britain. Sophie's law had been passed, allowing minors to testify in domestic violence cases with procedures specifically designed to protect and listen to them. Sarah had completely rebuilt her existence. She had graduated in psychology and now worked in a women's refuge, helping other women escape situations similar to her own. She had also written a book about her experience, becoming a recognized voice in the fight against domestic violence. But Sophie's true legacy was the thousands of letters she continued to receive. Children finding courage to speak, women leaving violent husbands, families rebuilding after years of silence and fear. One of these letters came from a girl named Emily, 9 years old, living in Manchester. She had read Sophie's story and understood she too could speak about her mother's boyfriend who hurt her. Now she knew someone would listen. Sophie read that letter and felt all the pain she had endured had profound meaning. She immediately called Manchester Social Services and personally ensured Emily received the help she needed. On graduation day, Sophie was invited to give the farewell speech for all her classmates. She stood on the auditorium stage, looked at the audience full of proud parents, and began speaking about the most important lesson she had learned. Truth has incredible power, and even a child's voice can change the world if it tells the truth. In a few months, she would start university to study law, not to become famous or win cases, but to ensure no child would ever have to grow up in fear again. The auditorium exploded in warm applause. Sophie saw Judge Hartwell in the audience, now retired, who gave her a sign of approval that filled her with infinite pride. In her conclusion, Sophie addressed all the children listening directly, telling them their voice matters, that their drawings, their words, their feelings are important. They should never be afraid to tell the truth, because somewhere there is always someone ready to listen. That afternoon, Sophie received an unexpected gift from the Old Bailey, a small golden scales with a note defining her as future Judge Thompson, and wishing that justice would always be with her. Sophie held that small scales in her hand and made a silent promise. She would spend her life protecting the innocent and giving voice to those who had none. Because sometimes justice has the face of a 12-year-old girl who finds the courage to tell the truth when all the adults have failed. If Sophie's incredible courage has moved you to tears and restored your faith in justice, Smash that like button and share this story with everyone who needs to hear it. This brave 12-year-old girl proves that even the smallest voice can change the world. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Sophie's situation? Have you ever witnessed someone find courage in impossible circumstances? Your stories inspire others to be brave. Subscribe now and hit all notifications for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in humanity. Ready for another mind-blowing story? Click on any video on your screen right now and discover more incredible tales of courage that will leave you speechless. Each story will change how you see the world.